Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great thing to hear so much discussion and dialogue happening. That, we will remind you, is the purpose of our gathering here this morning. So your dialogue and discussion means that things are working for this event here this morning. Good morning. My name is Aaron Sherinian. I am the Vice President for Public Relations and Communications here at the United Nations Foundation, and it's a pleasure on behalf of the partners who are bringing this event together, the International Women's Media Foundation, the Fund for Peace, the United Nations Foundation, RefugePoint, and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. It's a privilege to thank you for helping to change the narrative. The topic and the title of today's discussion. A few housekeeping items before I introduce the program and we get things started. We'd like to thank and remind that we have folks joining this event from live stream. This is an important room that has the power to do many, many powerful things, but we're also joined via live stream already from people in 7 different countries, and we are glad that people are joining us from around the world to help join the dialogue. Women's Voices is the hashtag that's been brought together, and it's on your name tags. You'll see it on your name tag there. The hashtag, of course, represents something more than a mere social media mechanism. It represents the way for people to engage from around the world. We will monitor your questions and your comments, and we'll share that dialogue as it happens. We encourage you to please, those of you here in the room, continue to help yourself to coffee and breakfast. We'd like to remind you to turn your phones down in terms of their ringer volume and to turn them up in terms of the volume of their impact. Here at the United Nations Foundation, we encourage you to be talking about what you're hearing, challenging some of the ideas that you're hearing, and helping this dialogue be as productive as possible. So please turn down the ringer volume and turn up the impact of your phone via your voice through social media. Today's program will be live streamed and will be live tweeted and then will be available on the websites of our partners later today. With those small housekeeping announcements, and again another welcome to each of you for joining us here at the United Nations Foundation, it is a privilege to introduce the President and CEO of the Foundation, who will start things off today as we change the narrative, Kathy Calvin. Kathy.
Thanks, Aaron. We had a party in here last night that had a DJ who was 12 years old, who had just performed at the White House. She was unbelievable. And now here we are with women talking again. So this is terrific, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm grateful to our partners for joining with us in putting together this substantive part of the White House Correspondents' Dinner weekend. And I want to especially say thank you to George Lehner. I was a originating board member, founder of the International Women's Media Foundation nearly 25 years ago, and I'm just so proud of how it's grown and continued to speak out for women's issues around the world. So we know there's a lot of talk this weekend in DC about the politics, and I'm excited today that we're going to talk and listen to women's stories today. It's so important that we not just tell stories, but that we're listening to stories around the world, whether it's the stories of women in Syria, where we know of the horrible experiences they're having and the pressures it's putting on Jordan and other countries around the world, whether it's women on the front lines in the climate battle, whether it's women journalists who are losing their lives for trying to tell a story, whether it's women peacekeepers who are critical to saving the peace around the world. We need to hear those stories, and we need to talk about all of them. And we know that women are resilient. I think that's one of the things that is a theme through all the stories I hear. And I've become a real fan of Eleanor Roosevelt as I look toward the 70th anniversary of the UN next year. She's been kind of a role model for me, and I've been doing a lot of reading about her view of the world so many years ago, and there's a lot we can learn from her. She was way ahead of her time, or maybe the times were way behind her. But she had a great quote that said, "Women are like tea bags. You never know how strong they are till you put them in hot water." So I have a feeling this is going to be the theme of Melanne's panel today. And I also want to say, from the founder and chairman of the UN Foundation, Ted Turner, he also challenges us every day to think about how we do our work to go beyond solving problems for women to advancing solutions by women. And I think that's a fundamental reminder to all of us about how we think about our work. So without much more ado, I want to just say thank you all for coming. It's a great honor to have such a good crowd here, and it's a real honor for me to be able to introduce my friend Melanne Verveer. You all know her, of course, from public policy, from Vital Voices, from serving as the first ever ambassador at large for global women's issues, for supporting Hillary Clinton and everything Hillary's done, to now leading the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Melanne has put women and girls in the heart of foreign policy throughout her whole career. And you know, she did such an incredible job as the first global ambassador for women that it's no longer the first ever, it's now a from now on position in our government, which is terrific. And I want to give her a special shout out because she's become a really important advisor and friend to both the former and current heads of UN Women, and it's so valuable that Melanne knows how important it is to play that role. So I want to welcome you, Melanne, and thank you for coming today and heading up this great panel. Thank you.
We want the panelists to come up. Well, good morning, everybody. You are a extraordinarily committed and dedicated group of people to be present to listen to this extraordinary panel this morning at this hour of the day. I want to say what a personal privilege it is for me to be here at the UN Foundation. I remember when it first came into being, and where it is today in terms of this space is just a metaphor for the kind of work that it is doing in so many arenas that matter so much to our world. I want to thank Kathy, who has been there for so many issues, and most particularly to say, Kathy, thank you for putting girls and women on the agenda of the UN Foundation in the way that you have done, and I think today's event is illustrative of that. I also think it's particularly meaningful that we gather for this discussion on the eve of what will be 3 major commemorations at the United Nations next year. One will be the 20th anniversary of the UN Fourth World Conference on Women that took place in Beijing, women's rights, our human rights. This issue, certainly in terms of women in conflict, was part of the platform for action. We have a long way to go in terms of realizing the importance of women in fragile states and certainly in zones of conflict. So I think looking forward to that renewed commitment that we all need to make, that looms large. Secondly, as you all know, I'm sure, we are going to the 15th anniversary of the Millennium Development Goals. And where do we go? How far have we come? And a big part of that has been a reflection of the post-2015 UN experts panel that has looked at the array of issues that still need to be resolved with all the progress that's been made, and fragile states looms large in that. And thirdly, next year will mark 15 years since the Security Council of the United Nations passed Resolution 1325, which explicitly links women to peace and security. And again, that is a tremendously unfinished agenda that calls all of us to greater efforts. So I think for all of those reasons, having this discussion at the UN Foundation this morning is that much more meaningful. We also know that denying women's rights is very much linked to the instability of countries. Women in many ways are like the canaries in the mines, and this is one of the underpinnings of Security Council Resolution 1325. If you look at the condition of girls and women in a society, and that condition is worsening, that is a sign of potentially even worse that is to come. So this role that women play as the early warning signals, I think is something that we don't pay enough attention to until it is much too late. And I also think that seeing women, not just as victims, they are surely victimized, and you will hear a lot about the conditions in which they find themselves. But that is not the beginning and end of the story. We need to begin to see women as they are through the lens of their agency. They are on the front lines of change all around the world, as Kathy stated. And understanding their role as agents of change is vitally important to the kinds of efforts that they need to play and need to be empowered to play and resourced to play, because it will make all of the difference. So to discuss all of this morning, we have an extraordinary panel. I must say that their bios blew me away, and I can't possibly do justice to any of them, or we would be here all day. But let me just say briefly a little bit about each of them. Starting to my left, Krist Hendry is the Executive Director of Fund for Peace. And under her direction, the Sustainable Development and Sustainable Security Program have become one of the most innovative of its kind, also working with the private sector to support the development and implementation of human rights policies, trainings, assessment frameworks, and so forth, including with companies that are basically extractives, oil, energy, mining, etc. I think this is a fascinating area in which to be operating, and one I think we seldom pay attention to. So good for you that you are on the cutting edge of all of this, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about a little bit of it. She's also been on the steering committee of the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, and the advocacy board to the Conflict Risk Network. So she's been engaged in the initial development of the Unlock program, which increases local conflict early warning and assessment capacity with civil society in very African nations. So Krista has a wealth of, I would say, innovative ways at operating in this space of fragile states that I know will contribute greatly to our discussion. And earlier, perhaps explaining it all, she worked in international trade and development. And I'll just say that she's got her MBA from Georgetown, because I'm now at Georgetown. Amy Slaughter is the COO of RefugePoint and has worked in the refugee field for nearly 20 years with many of the key NGOs who inhabit this space. For nearly a decade, she oversaw nationwide networks of resettlement offices contracted by the State Department to do that. But think back of all of these crises and all of the resettlement challenges they have created. She's worked with Iraqi Kurdish evacuees. She was on the first flight with the Kosovars when they were coming to the United States. She established one of the processing centers in Ghana. She has worked extensively with the International Office on Migration and with UNHCR. So Amy, we're so happy to have you here today to give us the perspective of refugees and what they're up against, and where women factor into all of that. And Ayuel is someone who I think gives us the on-the-ground perspective, what it's like to be a refugee. She fled Sudan as a child, lived in refugee camps for 7 years. She came to the United States with 89 other girls and 3,500 lost boys of Sudan. What does that tell you about priorities? Today, she is working on her MBA. She works at a nonprofit. She is married, has a child, and is leading a life probably that she couldn't imagine when she was leaving Sudan all those years ago. But she saw what happens to girls in refugee camps. She saw what happens to girls, especially who are orphaned or separated from their parents in these situations. And she can speak to the cause of girls everywhere and the imperative to all of us to watch out on their conditions in these situations. So welcome. And lastly, but not least, Elaisha Stokes. It's probably fitting that she's here during this White House Correspondents' Week and celebrating International Freedom in the Media Day, because she's an award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker. She's covered human rights and foreign affairs. She was awarded the International Media Foundation's Reporting Fellowship. She has had work appear in all kinds of media places, from the New York Times to Global Post, and her film production company has produced award-winning documentaries for national broadcast. And she is passionate about storytelling, so how the narratives fit into this expert policy world, I think, is critically important. And she has been fortunate to have her work supported by a number of influential grant makers. So let me start, Krista, with you. You are an expert on fragile states. What is a fragile state?
Well, a fragile state is a state that really cannot or will not protect its citizens. And that's why the topic of women is so important, because women and girls are the most vulnerable in a society. And in a fragile state, the government isn't there to protect them, and in some cases actually will endanger them.
So you put out a Fragile States Index.
Mm-hmm.
What does that index include, and how do women factor into that index?
Actually, we're going to be launching Fragile States Index 2014 next month here in Washington, D.C. We have a lot of changes in the index. You'll see the country's quite moving, some dramatically. But we look at a range of issues on their social, economic, political, and women really factor into a lot of those. How are women dealing with the demographic pressures? How are they being able to take care of their children? What public services are available? Health is of course, so important to women. And then really another one that's quite important is refugees and IDPs. We have an indicator just for this, and it's because we look not only at the number of refugees and IDPs in a country, but also how they're being treated. And how women are treated in those camps really tells you quite a lot about the society that they're in. It also puts a lot of pressure on other societies because they have to absorb a lot of refugees, and that takes away public services from their own citizens.
You know, one of the things we also know is the positive role that women play even in the most adverse conditions. One of the reasons the institute that I'm associated with now was founded in the last year is to really put together that data and research on how women are agents of change in conflict societies, how 1325, if you will, is being implemented. And I wonder, when you look at the work of your index, when you assess what's going on the ground, do you measure in any way the positive activities that women are engaged in and the roles that they play?
Actually, when I work on the ground on issues of community development, you mentioned the work with the private sector. One of the things we really try to stress is really getting the voice of the women when we're talking about how the community either should reconstruct after conflict or even just build in rural areas. What we've found is that men often want things. They want the buildings, the bridges, the roads. They see things more in the short term. This isn't always true. But women want services. They think about the health and the education. Now, we need both of these things. You need the buildings to have the doctors. And so you need both the women's perspectives and the men's perspectives. Too often, though, and particularly in post-conflict areas, we're not getting the women's voices. And this can be very disastrous. I think some people probably know the water well anecdote, some people in this room, which is, a group of men were asked what was needed in a village in reconstruction. And the answer was, oh, our women have to walk so far to get water. So we'd really like to have the water well right in the center of town. It sounded great. It sounded like they must have talked to women. This is for women to prevent them from having to walk so far. Well, the water well went in. The women were extremely upset. Turns out this area, I don't even know where this village was, the anecdote is so old, but this area had a huge amount of domestic violence. And that walk to get the water every day was when women were seeking solace and sharing ideas about how to prevent domestic violence. And now the men knew they didn't have to take that time, and they expected their women to be home. And they were afraid that there would be even greater domestic violence.
You know, it's one of the reasons that the United Nations, in its wisdom, and so many people working on these issues around the world have found that it's critically important to put a focus on the need for women's participation. because women bring a different perspective and set of experiences to the table. But if they're not at the table, those issues are not going to be addressed. I remember when the peace process that ultimately failed, the agreement was abrogated over not that many years later with Angola, an issue like landmines was on the table. And the determination was, well, the first place we need to remove those mines were in the areas that the men thought were important, and not in the fields where the agriculture work was going on, not near the water source. And so you had tremendous consequences that were never considered because these voices were not at the table. So I think women as problem solvers, as part of the solution, are something that needs to be factored in. And I guess the last thing for this round I'd like to ask you is, how do you, at the fund, focus on women as problem solvers in these spaces?
I just want to say one quick little anecdote on landmines. I was recently told a story that a security analyst had come into a country and he noticed that the men walked in front and women walked 3 feet behind. And he thought, well, this is really a shame. He really believed greatly in the importance of women being involved, and he didn't like to see this difference. And he was there for many months, and then he came back later, and he saw that the women were now walking in front, and the men were 3 feet behind. And he thought, like, I guess this is progress. And the man next to him said, no, landmines.
See who gets hit first.
So we really look, when another interesting thing on the index is when I look at the countries at the top of the index, which is the more fragile, the more conflicted, those are areas where we often see women not really involved in societies. And as you go down the index and you think about women in government, women in business, women running nonprofit organizations, you see that more and more as you come down through the index. And so I think really highlighting that more in our work is something that we will be doing, that when women have a role, we can actually really start to stabilize societies.
Good. We'll be watching to see how they get increasingly incorporated. Amy, you have spent an awful lot of time looking at the situation of refugees, which is a tremendous challenge in our world, and one, Kathy started talking about Syria. We've got people in the audience from Jordan, refugees pouring into Jordan, into Turkey, into Lebanon from Syria. What can you tell us about the state of refugees today, and particularly girls and women, more women and children, really, because that is the majority of the refugees. And what can we glean from that in terms of what we need to do?
Sure. Well, there are several unique challenges today that make this situation perhaps even more urgent than it has been, and that is kind of the confluence of several trends in the displacement world. One being that displacement is at record levels. 2013 was one of the worst years on record for new displacement in terms of new refugees created and new IDPs created, bringing the global total to 45 million displaced, of which 15 million are refugees. And a lot are from Syria, but from the African continent where we work, obviously from Somalia, Congo, Sudan. So there's that trend of increased displacement, and then there's also, as you alluded to, an increasing feminization of that displacement. So it's estimated that about 80% of all refugees are women and children. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get a disaggregated figure to break down women from the children, which is part of the problem. But we do know that women make up a good portion of the flow, partly because they are deliberately targets of war. A third trend is that increasingly refugees are moving to urban areas and bypassing the camps where the humanitarian infrastructure has been set up. So it's estimated that about 50% of refugees today actually live in urban areas where they're largely unassisted and off the humanitarian radar. And then, forgot my fourth trend. Refugees are staying refugees longer because of protracted conflict. So the average duration of that a person remains a refugee now is 17 years, and many never return home. For instance, in the Dadaab camp in Kenya, where we work, there are over 10,000 third-generation refugees born there, so whose grandparents originally fled from Somalia. So these are just 4 trends in the displacement world that create kind of a confluence of challenges for the international community, and all the more so for girls and women who are obviously among the most vulnerable among these populations. And one point that I'd like to make is you might imagine that after a refugee flees the country of conflict that they reach safety in another country, but often safety is a relative and an elusive notion, and actually each point along their journey brings new risks and new gender-specific risks for girls and women. And even after arrival in their countries of asylum, these risks continue. So things like sexual and gender-based violence, trafficking, domestic servitude, sexual slavery. And these sound like kind of theoretical worst-case scenarios, but they're actually very common scenarios that we see very often in our urban program in Nairobi with refugees.
So one of the things we also know is that women comprise the majority of the internally displaced. So some situations you've got the refugees where you're going across the border and fleeing your country, the conflict that's taking place. And in other situations, there are masses of internally displaced. Who has the jurisdictions in terms of the international bodies for the care and potential futures of these people?
It's not my area of expertise, but I know there's a cluster group at the global level, and that UNHCR does take responsibility for IDPs for some of the services, for shelter in particular for IDPs. I think there is a division of labor among the international organizations, and I actually don't know precisely beyond that.
You know, you mentioned how long generations of families, in fact, can spend their whole lives in the camps, and the next generation. And so policy issues that many of us deal with, like girls' education, for example, one of the toughest challenges is the need to provide that education in the camps, in the refugee areas. Can you tell us a little bit more about some of those challenges and ways that they're being addressed today?
Sure. I also think that Yar's presentation will touch on that as well, because she experienced that personally, the challenge of being a girl in a camp and accessing education. But in general, primary education is provided in camps. That's usually guaranteed through a combination of the government and UNHCR and international donors. Secondary education is almost completely absent. And even the primary education that exists is not very girl-friendly. There are a lot of reasons why girls, because of their domestic responsibilities, are not able to attend school. And the school that is offered is, very high ratio of students to teachers, poorly trained teachers, no materials.
Lots of challenges.
Lots of challenges.
Now, what about the framework of international laws? Are they adequate today to cover refugees, given what you said about the major trend lines, or do we need to be doing better?
Adequate, in particular for women and girls. I would say yes and no, and it depends on who's interpreting refugee law. And this is an area of a lot of debate, and there has been some progress on this in recent years. But the types of harm that women experience can be different than the types of harm that men experience. And it's not as easy to link those types of harm to the 5 grounds that are sanctioned by the Refugee Convention. So for instance, the kinds of abuses that women are experiencing in Congo with epidemic rape, where the motives can be difficult to sort out, whether it's politically motivated, ethnically motivated, or just private. Those types of claims can be very difficult to link to a Refugee Convention claim. But I do think that there has been progress in expanding our understanding of refugee law to extend more to women's types of harm.
Yar, before you tell us why we should be spending so much attention and having greater understanding about the plight of girls, tell us your story. Tell us about the journey that you had to make when you were leaving South Sudan, or Sudan, with your family, and what happened to them and how you got where you are.
I left South Sudan when I was about 7 years old and go to Ethiopia with my father. And then on my way back to South Sudan, my father died and my brother and I were alone. I was probably 9 and he was 4 or 5 at that time. And then we moved to Kenya with the rest of the Lost Boys. where we stayed there and then came to the United States.
How long were you in Kenya?
About 8 years. And being there at the refugees camp with no parents to protect me, I faced so many challenges like many other girls. The lack of protection and the attack on refugees women, and also the lack of access to education. Girls live with relatives or some foster home where they will perform domestic chores. So education is not a priority for girls. So for me, when I get a chance, I will go to night prep. And that was very dangerous because of the things that I mentioned, the attack on women, and also not be able to do the things that I wanted to do because of fear of being a girl.
And we know that there were the lost boys of Sudan as well. How would you say from your experience they were treated? How did their experience differ from that the girls encountered, if at all?
The guys lived together. They fence for each other. For the girls, they lived with families, and also they didn't have the network support that the guys have. So the girls were much vulnerable than guys because they got each other back.
So you heard Amy talk about policies, and you have the experience. You know firsthand what it was like. Out of that experience, if you were telling all of us today, as you are, what we should be doing vis-a-vis the issue of girls as refugees, what major issues come out of your experience that is something we should bear in mind today as we're working on working in these areas?
That I never a priority. Girls never a priority when it comes to education. But I think if the women and girls are allowed to have the same access to education as boys, they will do just amazing things as the guys will.
And did you see that the boys were getting a better education? Was that comparable, or?
When they can study when they can, they didn't have domestic chores. They have their own things to take care of, but they can go freely to the night prep without fear. But for me, I was afraid of being attacked or something worse could happen to me. So the guys have not got it easy, but they're there as a group to protect each other.
And did you witness a lot of violence in the camps? Did the girls tell you, the other girls, how scared they were or how you felt?
We were scared, especially when we go to the distribution center at night to collect our ration. So we just kind of walk together hoping that nothing bad is going to happen to us. But for guys, they just walking together and just say, I hope nothing bad is going to happen to me. So we always walk on fear. The refugees women are always afraid of being attacked or worse.
So, Amy, you were telling us about some of the serious policy challenges that exist. We heard Yar's personal story. What comes out of that should be informing our work, and how do you use a narrative like this to promote the work in the whole refugee sphere?
Well, I've always thought that refugees are the best war correspondents, and since this is a media event, I think it's worth thinking about how their voices can influence policy and affect change and create a multiplier effect to help find solutions for other refugee women. So I would just encourage the media to incorporate refugee women voices whenever they can.
So I guess that's a perfect segue to you, Elaisha.
I'll do my best.
What is the storyline in the media on girls and women in fragile states?
I think that the storyline is really influenced by who gets to tell the story. And when you look at war correspondents, they're primarily white men with great educations. And so they are viewing those situations with a certain lens. That's going to determine who gets to tell the story and how that story is told. Women tend to speak to one another with more intimacy and authenticity than they might speak to a man who doesn't speak their language, doesn't really know about their country. And so what we see in the media is this, first of all, women are underrepresented in the media, full stop. I mean, women don't work in the media, and when women are reported on, it's usually, in the case of Congo, which is where I primarily work, as victims of sexual violence. And certainly there is tremendous issue with sexual violence in the Congo, but there's also a huge emerging middle class of very strong, powerful women who are working on issues like Resolution 1325. I work with a group of women in South Kivu, the Association de Femmes de Médias de Sud Kivu, and they go into these terrible situations to put women's voices on the radio and educate them on 13.
Is that Chuchu's group?
Yeah, Chushu. She's like my best friend, love her. But we can't sell that story. You know, we're making a documentary and we can't sell that story. I just did a huge report on the Minova case where somewhere between 133 and 1,000 women were raped by the Congolese military just south of Goma about a year and a half ago. And it's a very important story, and it's an important story in terms of women's justice and global women's justice and what we see happening at the ICC. But at the same time, it's a story that is the dominant narrative from the DRC. And when it's told, it's not told from the women who experience that violence, it's told from the organization's perspective that are potentially, they have their own agenda. And so how do we honor these stories in a way that is authentic, that is respectful? We've got to go to the source. We've got to get the women on the radio, in the media, speaking for themselves, telling their own stories.
And I know from the group, because I have had experience with them over the years, that there's very little funding. They've got critical needs. They've got, they not only want to get the story out, they want to have the story among themselves in terms of how they can better protect themselves, how they can look at their futures. And to buy an hour of radio time in this very remote area is extremely costly, right?
Extremely costly. And you know, I'm working right now with a femme in Shushu in a town called Kachenga, which is just north of Goma, where there was a radio. The rebels came, burned the town down, and took the radio. So the women there, who are very powerful women, these are powerful, strong, okay, they're not economically empowered, but they're doing things for themselves. They want their voices on the radio. They're ready to organize. They're ready to do what it takes. But there's no money. There's absolutely no money, which is why an organization like the International Women's Media Foundation, I have to give them a shout out, has been so critical, because they fund these projects, and they fund these projects with no strings attached, which is really, it's a rarity in the field. And you have to do that in order to get these voices in the media, because they're not easy to sell.
And one of the great intermediaries is the role of journalists from the outside looking inside. You mentioned there's a dearth of women in the field, but where there are women as correspondents in conflict zones, for example, in these fragile, very fragile areas, do they cover the situation differently? Do they tell some of these stories more than their male counterparts?
I think they tell the stories differently. And I mean, I don't want to, I can speak about my work, I don't want to cast stones, but you know, there's, in the situation of sexual gender-based violence in the Congo, there are a lot of visual images. I should mention that I'm primarily a video journalist, so I work in visual medium and documentary. And when we look at the language, the visual language of these photos, they're women with bags on their heads. To me, those photos are evocative of Abu Ghraib. They're disrespectful. They lump women together. They don't honor those stories and that personal narrative of how tragic that was. And so when I work with women, I try to, why I love video is it's women speaking in their own voices, telling their own story. It's not me paraphrasing, it's not me quoting. Obviously there are editorial choices that are made, but when you watch something like that, you are hearing from the source what it's like to live that reality. And I think that's incredibly evocative and powerful and emotional, and that's how we change policy, in my opinion.
We're going to turn to all of you to join this conversation in a minute, so think about what you might want to ask the panel. But before we do, Elaisha, I have found that the women know their situation, know how horrible what they're going through is. They do want that message to get out, but they don't want to be viewed as victims. No. They want to be seen as the agents of change that they are. And I've often told this story, but it never has left me. And that is being in a group like this, just a conversation in Kabul, Afghanistan, when the first thing one of the women said to me is, stop looking at us as victims and look at us as the leaders that we are. Because the story is always about the victimhood to the extent that it's covered. And it's not about the problem solvers, the agents for change. Do you see that in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always trying to do better personally because it's not easy, and certainly I make mistakes because I'm not an expert in what it is to be a refugee. I've never been a refugee. I have a very privileged background. But I think that the importance is to work with people as people. In news media, you know, there's this long tradition of objectivity, and I am the storyteller and you are the person with the story. And I think that that's important. Facts matter. But it's also important to be collaborative with your subject matter because the factual reality is the story that they're telling you. That has authenticity and value also. And so bringing somebody along in that process, for example, you know, when I'm taking an image of somebody, when I'm videoing them, I will often stop the camera. I love this because technology has improved. Show them what it looks like and say, how do you feel about this? Are you comfortable with this? Can we continue? Because if they're not comfortable, if they don't feel that it's an accurate representation, then it's not a factually accurate representation. And we need to work together to get to the truth, in my opinion.
I'm going to put in a shameless plug, but one of the things we're trying to do at the Georgetown Institute is create an oral history. So we've got some of the major players from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and Mary Robinson, but also most of the voices of the kinds of women you're describing. So if you want at any point for us to have your stories as well, you are welcome to have us put those into the oral history for others around the world to be able to access.
Yeah, and these women's stories too, like it's not, my story is boring. Their story is way
It's
more
their
interesting.
stories.
And they are better at telling it and they're ready to tell it.
Well, we can go on here, but why don't we hear from all of you? I know there's a wealth of experience in this room. We have microphones.
Hi, my name is Ayesha. I'm actually Melanne, Master Verveer's deputy at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, and in fact, I created the Profiles in Peace Oral Histories project that she just mentioned. And my question is to Elaisha exactly about that. How do you deal with the ethical challenges that come with this? Because obviously telling the story is important, but it can pose a risk for the subject,
Yes.
especially in video form.
Yes.
And how do you navigate that? What do you say? And how do you deal with it on your own? Because our team is sitting here, and this is something we deal with every day, and we are not professional filmmakers or journalists.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I haven't slept in like 3 weeks because of this piece on the Manova trials, in which I would encourage you all to check it out because it's launching a year of reporting at Global Post on women's justice, and we need more stories about women's justice. But check out the video. Some people are not going to like it. That's cool. She is somewhat identifiable. So we worked with one woman who experienced rape and wanted to tell her story. And of course, there are a number of NGOs that are involved in this sphere that are assisting these women with the trial. And so it was like, how do we do this in a way that's respectful, that honors her story, and that doesn't put her life at risk? She made decisions. I obviously also made editorial decisions. We worked with partners. We worked with a local NGO, like a Congolese NGO that was assisting the women. They have a rape crisis center there. We worked with the American Bar Association, which obviously has so much experience. And we constantly, every step along the way, asked ourselves, okay, what's the impact of this? How do we balance the impact of the importance of this story and the importance of people emotionally connecting with this story and protecting this person's life? And ultimately made judgment calls. But I think all you can do is check your intentions, make sure this is not about you, it's about the greater narrative. And my number one strategy is I surround myself with people who are smarter than me. And women are experts in their own lives. Women, those are the experts, right? It's not me, a journalist, who's an expert. My job is to listen and to be a conduit and to respect their boundaries and what they want. And so often we make rules in the media, in the NGO world, in the policy world around how these women can behave and how they can tell their story. They know better than we do. And if we listen and work together, then hopefully we find a middle ethical ground. But it is difficult. And you will make mistakes, and I will make mistakes. That's just the reality.
Others? Over there, there's a gentleman here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Frank Smythe. I'm with Global Journalist Security. And Elaisha, I want to follow up on a similar question. You and I recently heard Gina Moore, the international women's correspondent for BuzzFeed, talk about her criticism of the way a lot of news media will cover acts of sexual violence. And it was a criticism that I never heard before, but still resonates with me. Could you explain what she's talking about the need to respect the context and the women itself and the way the story is told?
Yeah, Gina's like my best friend. She's amazing. If you haven't read what she's doing on BuzzFeed, it's incredible. But basically, the idea is that in situations of rape, there are journalism codes that we are supposed to adhere to around identification, anonymity, safety. Those are all really important, obviously. But there's also the reality of being a victim of sexual violence, which I'm sure many women in this room have also experienced, because rape happens here too. And how we want to tell our own stories and how we want to be honored for the reality of what we experienced, and how that can actually be a very empowering process if it's treated with respect and navigated in a respectful capacity. And I mean, in the case of at least the DRC, like, we do not see that. We see numbers. Those numbers are often inaccurate. People want to have these big numbers to put a barometer on truth. Well, that's not truth. The truth is the experience that one individual had in one moment. That is the factual truth for them. And so how do we shy away from lumping women together in one giant welcome to the rape capital of the world, and instead honor an individual and their experience and their story, if they want to share it. And that's the key there, if they want to share it and how they want to share it.
Okay, let's go to the back right there.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I actually just wanted to ask UNHCR representative about...
Can you be a little louder? Can you talk right into
yeah,
the mic?
sorry. I just wanted to ask the UNHCR representative about women's leadership in context of conflict and fragile states. And if you're doing what you're doing to engage women in conflict resolution and areas of leadership and cultivating local leadership.
You're asking me?
The UNHCR representative.
I'm with an NGO, actually. I'm not with UNHCR.
Okay.
I'm with RefugePoint. And yeah, I'm afraid since I'm not with UNHCR, I can't answer that.
But it's a good question in terms of how do we grow women's leadership? Is that the question?
Yeah.
In terms of being more effective in conflict resolution?
Yeah, exactly. Making them a part of the process.
Does anybody else want to tackle that? No. And obviously, that's one of the key elements in the Security Council 1325, which is the important role that women have to play in these negotiations, in these processes to ameliorate crises and then move forward in the post-crisis peace building that needs to take place to create a better future for all of the people who've gone through it. And without the experiences that women have, without their knowledge, their ground truth experiences that so need to be on the table, what we find historically is that many of those agreements, most of which happen without women's participation, end up being abrogated, at least half of them. So we have to do a better job, and there are others involved in this space, inclusive security, for example, that works at the training of women and helping them work through the differences that they can make. And then those of us who've been in government or in positions of influence at the UN, et cetera, to do that advocacy to ensure that as the decision makers with whom we work can be influential, that they're actually being voices for women participation. So I think it has to be outside, inside as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to just jump in there because one of the things my organization does is we train local civil societies. We use the same kind of comprehensive look at a country as we use with the Fragile States Index, but at a very, very local level. And when we train those civil society organizations, we make sure that we've got a fair balance of men and women and also different age groups so that they can assess their situation themselves. The Fragile States Index is 40,000 foot level. This brings it down and lets the people there themselves, civil society organizations, but also individuals, assess their needs, assess the pressures on their state, assess what they want to do together, and then in collaboration, decide how to advocate to government for the things that they believe are needed to stabilize their societies.
Anybody else want to take that? No? Okay. Others? You've had your hand up for a long time. You, yeah.
Hi, I'm Hannah Alam from McClatchy Newspapers. My question is for Yar. Thank you very much for sharing your experience. Secretary Kerry's in Juba today, and I was wondering, what would you like him to say or do? And is there something in particular as it relates to women and girls in this conflict that you'd like to highlight? And is it time for sanctions as a tool to pressure toward a resolution? Thanks.
I would like to tell him that put political pressure on South Sudanese leaders, and also my worry about women. Women are the vulnerable population who get caught in everything that goes on in the country. So to provide some sort of protection for these women, most of them, I have relatives there. I have sisters who are really worried about their safety and their children's safety. So to just give a political pressure to South Sudanese leader and just to tell them to stop this.
We have time for one more. Sanctions?
Possibly, yeah.
Sir?
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Majuk with the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I want to make comment and also ask questions directly to the media. The story that you are shared with all of us here is my story, because I've been in the refugee camp for more than a decade. And I commend people like Yar and other women who have been through all this, and to be able to tell the narrative from their perspective on what women needs are. Because we men do not exactly know what women needs are, but they can be able to express themselves, their needs, especially in a vulnerable place like the refugee camp. And so I do believe women are resilient, and if given the opportunity, they are equal to men in different capacities. With that, I would like to ask that question about cultural challenge in reporting, especially in telling the women narrative. Because you don't, how do you deal with this? The comment that will follow is this. If you are interviewing women, for example, in the refugee camp, where the culture contact is foreign to you, you don't understand the context, then by interviewing them and telling that story, those words could be used against them, okay, after you left as an international reporter. So how do you strike that balance when you go to a foreign culture where women are treated differently? Because you don't want to use the word that they said against them. That will make them victim forever.
Yes.
And so how do you strike that balance?
Yes.
Culture is everything. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's an excellent question. Culture is everything, and I am not a Congolese woman. And so that's a challenge. But I live with Congolese women. When I go to Congo, I stay there for 3, 4, 5 months, and I literally live in their homes and sleep in their beds, and they are my best friends, and they, as I said before, they are the experts. So if I have a question, I defer to them, and I say, okay, I'm lucky because I have an army of people who I can say, what do you think about this? Is this working? How do you think this narrative is going to affect this woman? And also, you know, you're dealing in a situation where there's a lot of variation in the terms of economic power, education, and personal agency that women have. So I have friends who have degrees, they have more education than I have. And I work also in IDP camps with women who have been fleeing their whole lives and haven't had that opportunity to invest in their educations. And sometimes if somebody doesn't, it can be difficult when you work in the media to make sure that your subject understands the power of the process that you are both engaging in. So how what they say could, as you mentioned, be used against them. And so what I do is I deflect those questions to women who know more about Congo because they are Congolese than I do, and I show them what I'm working on, and I say, what do you think about this? What are the risks here? Is this okay? What would this be allowed to happen in Congo? Would you report the story this way? And they're honest with me because, you know, we live together, so they give me the straight goods. And somehow we try and find a solution that is good for everybody. Is it perfect? No. Do I want Congolese women telling those stories? Absolutely. This is the film project that I'm trying to work on with young journalists working on Resolution 1325. For whatever reason, the international news media doesn't seem particularly receptive to local people telling their own stories, and it's not good. We need to collectively work towards that. It's really important, absolutely, to have local journalists working in international press, not just local press, and I hope we get there.
And I think support for local journalists is critically important. We often, in the grant-making world, negate the importance of media in these places that can be very constructive and helpful. I'm afraid I'm being told we have to close. I would only encourage those of you, quite a significant number who still have their hands up, that the panel will stay a little bit so you can ask them your questions and hopefully continue to mingle with each other to discuss this topic. But I hope leaving today you feel more informed and recognize that when it comes to fragile states, conflict zones, women have a vital role to play. We need to listen to their voices because they are in many ways the vital voices of our time. So thank each of our panelists and thank all of you for coming.